forgot to plug this DVD that David gave to me, which we're selling for only $10 now. Yazoo Revisited. Let me explain what it is.
Well, it's another riff on my father's work. It's about revisiting the integration of the schools in Yazoo City in 1970.
Okay, shall we begin?
Shall we begin?
It'd be good to have you in Oxford. It's a really terrific book, and it's not just letters from Willie and David's pictures, full of his pictures, but a lot of his very valuable commentary about his dad and the period of both their lives. And I just
You really have to kind of talk right at that microphone.
all right, and talk to the microphone. Everybody hear me okay?
Talk at it, Curtis. Talk at it.
All right, anyway, David, early in the book, you wrote, quote, "For many years I existed not as David Ray Morris, photographer, but rather simply as Willie's son," close quote. Now, I don't want to pose as a pseudo psychologist here, but there's so many things that come up in the course of the book that kind of beg questions like this one. So here goes. Did this particular, maybe resentment that you had, did that create any kind of problems between you and your dad?
I don't know that specific instance did, but I would say that I still am identified as Willie's son today. So it's something that I sort of, I think years ago I just kind of threw up my hands and said, if you can't fight them, join them. And used, and I've done this, well, especially with in the documentary I made about Yazoo City, where I was, in the origins of that film were sort of related to Governor Barber's comments about the Citizens Council and the integration of the schools in Yazoo City. And I knew that I had to have Haley in the film. And so I very carefully orchestrated going to the Neshoba County Fair in 2011, when Haley was giving his last speech as governor, and indicated to several people, friends of mine, when we have the opportunity, introduce me as Willie's son. And I call it playing the Willie card, because I know that, and to Haley's credit, he gave me an hour of time as a sitting governor in an interview, which I use a lot of footage for that in the film. But if I hadn't done that, I don't know that he would have given me the time of day. So it's both joyous and burdensome in terms of resentment or bad feelings. I think there were other things that caused resentments and hard feelings. So living in his shadow was sort of just kind of an occupational hazard for me. But it was there, and there was nothing I could do about it. So
It probably opened some doors for you.
Certainly.
But and there are worse people you could have been identified with.
Well, I don't know if Richard would have invited me here if it hadn't been for.
Anyway, you describe these letters as a roadmap to your relationship with Willie. There are many expressions of love from your dad in the book, but there are also letters where he gives at best kind of grudging apologies for things he did that were hurtful to you. There's clearly a refusal by Willie to confront his drinking problems, and there are constant references through these letters to his financial problems, the debts that he had, and sometimes it seemed he didn't know where his nickel was coming from. So at one point you wrote that, quote, didn't know how to deal with his idiosyncrasies. Any way you can easily describe, I'll give you more than 25 words, but the relationship that you felt you had with your dad.
Well, I mean, as I point out in my introduction, that, you know, my father was from a generation of American men born before World War II who just could not express their emotions directly and honestly. He could do it if he'd been drinking, but he couldn't, you know, just look me in the eye and say something deep and profound.
You said he was able to do that more in his writing. Than
Well,
kind of
since he was already an accomplished writer, you know, he had no problems communicating his feelings and his emotions in his letters, and that was sort of a contradiction for me, because that the person of the letters was not always the person I knew in person. So it created this sort of bizarre situation. And what I described doing is picking up the camera. You know, the camera. I started as a photographer when I was quite young, and I was a shy kid, and the camera gave me a kind of license to go out and do what I wanted to do. It served as a protection. And you know, you worked in newspapers, so surely you've worked with photographers in war zones who would say the same thing, that the camera served as a kind of a buffer to protect them from the horror of what they were seeing. So at some point, I turned the camera on my father as a way of trying to understand what the situation was and trying to work through my own sense of confusion and emotions. And so what the result of that was that I have a lot of really pretty amazing pictures of my father, and pretty honest pictures of my father all through his life. And they sort of, in this case, they complement the letters.
Willie had been to kind of a literary mountaintop while he was still a young man.
Mm-hmm.
He had written one masterpiece, North Toward Home. And when he was still young in New York, he became editor of one of the most prestigious magazines in America, Harper's. And while he was there, he assembled an incredible team of writers who contributed regularly to it. People like Norman Mailer and David Halberstam, Marshall Frady, Larry Elkine, and others. And I still think it's one of the great magazines that I can ever remember reading during that period that Willie edited it. And he, of course, lost his job in the conflict with the owners, and a little bit before that, he and your mother had divorced, and he went out to the Hamptons and, you know, to live among the wealthy, beautiful people, which he did for a number of years. And he's got a lot of missives from there, from that time, and he seemed in these letters to always be talking about what a wonderful time he was having, whether he's drinking at Bobby Van's or playing softball, et cetera, but it also seemed to me that they could have masked some real sadness he had during that period. Did you draw any kind of interpretation like that?
I never quite thought of it as that way, but I mean, I think certainly he, you know, falling from that literary mountaintop that he was on when he left Harper's was certainly had a tremendous impact on him. And I think it took a number of years for him to find direction again. And ultimately, I don't think he really found it until he came back to Mississippi and came to Oxford and started teaching at the university. And then, thanks to David Halberstam, who you mentioned, started working on the courting of Marcus Dupree. I like to say that, you know, my father left Mississippi in 1952 because his father had come to him. His father, my grandfather, who died before I was born, had, on his own, the way my father tells the story, he's written about it in several different places. My grandfather, on his own, took the bus, the Greyhound bus out to Austin and toured the campus of the University of Texas and came back and told my father, you need to leave Mississippi and you need to go to the University of Texas. And I think at that point my father was all set to come here, come to Oxford, and marry his high school sweetheart, and that'd be the end of it. And going to Texas, I think, changed his life in many ways. Obviously, he ended up becoming the editor-in-chief of the Daily Texan, which was the great student newspaper at the university, and then he immediately got entangled in issues of censorship with the Board of Regents, who wanted to control what he wrote about and what the newspaper wrote about, and that sort of put him on the map, on the national map. And then, of course, he had a Rhodes Scholarship. And so I like to say that he left in 1952 and really went into what was self-imposed exile for 30 years until enough had changed that he felt comfortable coming back. And by the time he got to Oxford in 1980, I think he was delighted at how Mississippi, in his eyes, had evolved from the time when he was in high school.
You mentioned his writing of the courtship of Marcus Dupree, and he clearly had high hopes for that book, and it was a pretty amazing story. This was a outstanding football player from Philadelphia, Mississippi, who was sought after by virtually every college in America, and then you juxtapose that with the history at Philadelphia going back to 1964, and three of the most horrific murders in the civil rights movement took place there. So there were all sorts of elements in this that I think so many people thought it was going to be a terrific book, and it kind of wound up not quite becoming what surely Willie hoped for, or all his fans did. And of course, Marcus Dupree's career crashed and burned too. So that had to be a disappointment that I think. Also, he talked repeatedly in the letters about TAPS, which was going to be this book. It's going to be essentially based on his own childhood in Yazoo City. He worked on it for years. He referred to it in one letter to you as my albatross. He was never able to finish the book. It finally did come out posthumously. But those things struck me as really enormous disappointments to him.
Yeah, and of course, Marcus Dupree, you know, some of the shortcomings of that were not his fault. Because those will remember that Marcus Dupree ended up going to Oklahoma and went missing in the fall of 1983, right when the book was coming out. But apparently, because somebody hadn't entered a code in the computer system from the publisher, all the books sat in the warehouse for 6 weeks. So when it was national news that this great running back had disappeared and that this book was coming out, there were no copies available. So, and with TAPS, you know, TAPS, I think the first letter he refers to TAPS was from 1979, and then he made an attempt to finish it in 10 years later in 1989, and he struggled with it, and ultimately the publisher rejected it, and I think that was hard on him. It was only his second novel. You know, the first novel he wrote was the Last of the Southern Girls, which was a thinly veiled portrait of his girlfriend at the time, Barbara Hauer, which didn't do particularly well because she put out a book at the same time, which was wildly successful. So he was stuck in her shadow. But I didn't read Taps, and when he died, Joanne, his widow, spent about a year editing it, because she was an old editor, and I think she ended up cutting about 100 pages, because it just was sort of unbalanced and unclear. And I haven't read the unedited manuscript, but I did read what finally was published, and you know, it's quite beautiful. And of course, his friend, his best friend James Jones, Kaylee Jones, who wrote my beautiful foreword, is the daughter of James Jones. She noted in her foreword that her father, who's the great World War II novelist, said that Taps was some of the most beautiful writing that he had ever read, and that was, and Jim died in '77, so my father was already at work on it in the mid
And
'70s.
he didn't finish his last book, and your dad finished it for him,
Yeah,
called Whistle.
Whistle, which was what Jim was working, was the last book of his trilogy, which was From Here to Eternity, The Thin Red Line, and Whistle. And Whistle was about the wounded soldiers from World War II in the hospital in what was really Memphis. He calls it Luxor. And they would have these long conversations, and my father would tape them because Jim was dying. He had congestive heart failure, and Jim had it all laid out. So they would have these conversations about what was going to happen to which character and when. And so Jim died about 4 chapters from finishing, and my father basically wrote the summary of the last 4 chapters. But then Jim had written the last 5 pages of the book. So at the end of the summary of the 4 chapters, it switches back into Jim's voice, and he finished his own book.
A few years after Willie's death, his friend Larry King, one of the writers at Harper's, and also Larry wrote The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and became disgustingly wealthy, like most writers. But he wrote a sort of biography of your dad called In Search of Willie Morris that dealt with some of the same warts that we're talking about that we all have. And Larry wrote that Willie seemed, quote, strangely untroubled over not paying debts, close quote, and described his habit of sleeping late as a way of ignoring his problems and a symptom of depression. Now, on the surface, Willie was one of the most ebullient characters you could ever meet, but
Larry was pretty flamboyant too.
you know, he was, he sure was. But you think that Willie was at all tortured by clinical depression like his friend William Styron?
Obviously, I'm not a doctor or a therapist, so I can't
It's
render.
okay, I'm not a psychologist.
I never, certainly he used alcohol as a form of entertainment and jubilantness. I never thought that he was depressed. Certainly not the way Styron was, because Styron was committed. I mean, Styron was, became unable to function, and my father was never not able to function, and there were times when he would be out late. I remember one time when I was in Oxford, and I had like a 7 or 8 a.m. flight out of Memphis, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and he was raging strong, and I went to bed not knowing if I was going to make that plane, but to my amazement, at 6 o'clock in the morning, my father was up and showered and shaved and put on his Old Spice and drove me to the airport. So, certainly we all go through periods of sadness and melancholy, but I never saw anything to indicate, any kind of major clinical episode, except when Pete died. when his dog Pete died, he took it pretty hard. And there's a letter in the book that he wrote me about 2 weeks later, talking about how painful that was.
I want to get to animals in a
Animals.
moment. You have any number of really outstanding photographs in your book, but some of them are, some that, might be jarring to people that would expect the son to have nothing but flattering pictures of his dad, and some of these Willie's clearly totally pie-eyed, drunk, brooding, I think at times probably from drinking too much. And, you were able to quit drinking early yourself in your own life, and a lot of other people in Willie's circle were able to quit drinking. And you, like, children do, you implored your dad to, just knock it off, and basically never did. How destructive do you think alcohol was to Willie, in terms of just his personality and his role as a father?
At times it was very, I don't know if destructive is the right word, but it was not helpful. I think, and he admits in New York days that when he's recounting his days at Harper's that he went to too many parties and he drank too much. Right after my parents were divorced, I would, every other Friday, and I was only 9 or 10, I would ride the subway from school and go straight to the offices of Harper's, and would walk right into his office and sit down, and would spend the weekend with him. And he could be a very good father. We would go to see the Knicks play, and we would go bowling in Madison Square Garden, and there was a Chinese restaurant around the corner called the Empire. We would go have food there. And so there were times that he was quite responsible and quite caring. There were other times, more so as I got older, and he had less of a responsibility of looking after me, that he would just go off on his own little tears, and me be damned. And we had several encounters that were not pleasant. But there were 2 instances where I said something to him, and they were not received very well. But there is one letter that he wrote me from 1989, which has always been the hardest letter for me to reread. But every time I reread it, I said, he came really, really close to apologizing and saying what was in his heart. And I sort of retroactively admire him for doing that. But I think part of it was his personality. Part of it was, that he was so well known, so young, that he was put up on that pedestal at such a young age. And when you're up on the top of the world, there's only one direction to go. And so I think he struggled at times trying to re-achieve that status on the top of his game.
Do you think he squandered some of his prodigious talent as a writer because of alcohol? Some people say that alcohol fueled Faulkner. Faulkner would have been great had he not been a heavy drinker.
I certainly think that, if he had quit drinking in 1968, I think his life would have taken a different trajectory. One of my little interventions, I sent him a book that was I think it was either a doctoral dissertation or it was written by a university professor who examined alcohol in the works of Faulkner, Hemingway, and O'Neill. I think there was a fourth one, but I can't remember who it was. And of the three or four, O'Neill was the only one who quit drinking, and 20 or 30 years after he'd gotten sober, went on to write some of these great plays. So certainly if he had stopped drinking at an earlier age, you know, it would have taken him in a different trajectory, but who knows what that would have been. I know that, I haven't had a drink at 30 years, and I know my life has taken, you know, a better trajectory. It doesn't mean that there are not struggles and hardships, you know, but I feel pretty healthy because of it, and I feel like I have a really healthy relationship with my daughter, and that's part of trying to tie all this together, which I do in my epilogue.
Enough of sorrows, let's get to some of the joys. Dogs, for instance. You know, years ago, David Halberstam said to me, we've got to do something to get Willie to stop writing about these effing dogs. And he felt that, you know, he was, you know.
But then what did Halberstam say after My Dog Skip came out?
Well, that was around the time that My Dog Skip came out. I think that may have provoked it. But he felt that Willie should be dealing with more serious subjects. But, you know, I think people who love animals are something special about them and something good. And it seemed to me that Willie had a great love of animals. He learned to like cats. He certainly loved dogs. He even stole a dog from you at one point. But talk about Willie and his love for dogs.
Well, I guess it all goes back to Skip. He'd had dogs before Skip. He had a series of hunting dogs. I think it was Jimbo. I can't remember, there were three of them. I can't remember their names. I think Jimbo was one of them. But obviously Skip was, you know, what put him on his canine map. And, you know, he loved Skip. When I was 5, he bought me, we went over to upstate New York, and he got me a black Labrador retriever named Ichabod Crane, and which is the dog he stole from me about 6 years later. But
And you had an exchange over that.
well, we had an exchange later. I mean, what happened was my mother and I were going on vacation, and I asked him to watch the dog, and when we came back, he refused to give the dog back. And I was 11, you know, what are you going to do when your father doesn't give back your dog? And it was sort of an underlying resentment for a while. But when he was working on New York Days, he had a passage about Ichabod being his dog, and I very respectfully referred him to the passage in North Toward Home where he talked about driving his 6-year-old son to upstate New York to buy him a dog. And I wrote in the margin of the manuscript, Ichabod was my dog. And quite to my surprise, he wrote back and acknowledged it and said, of course Ichabod was your dog. And that sort of, it was like bursting a balloon. It was like years of unspoken tension was resolved just by the fact that he acknowledged that that slight. And of course Pete came along. Pete was sort of the town dog in Bridgehampton, and he belonged to the guy who ran the service station. I actually photographed Pete when I was working for the East Hampton Star, and I did a story about the dogs of Bridgehampton. And one day the following year, Pete just shows up at my father's house and wouldn't leave. And they just bonded. He himself called them brothers. They were inseparable. And when my father moved to Mississippi in 1980, Pete was lying in the back seat of my grandmother's '74 Plymouth, which we called the Zoomobile. And Pete, and this is a true story, Pete is actually buried in St. Peter and had a headstone, which I believe was stolen, I think Mayor Leslie, in 1983, when Pete died, Mayor Leslie surreptitiously arranged for Pete to be buried in St. Peter. And there was a headstone for a while. I don't know, and I could tell you about where it was in the cemetery. It's not too far from the old Faulkner plot. But I believe that the tombstone, which just said Pete, disappeared. So when Pete died in 1983, I remember I was here in January, and Pete was in pretty bad shape. He couldn't walk, and I was very selfish, and I patted him on the head and said, "Pete, I love you, but can you wait a few more weeks?" Because I didn't want to be there. And he died on Groundhog Day, and I think it was Charles Henry who called me and gave me a heads up that afternoon. So when the call came that night, and there was just a huge Irish wake going on at 16 Faculty Row, and my father was pretty emotionally devastated and incoherent. They put him on the phone and we exchanged a few words, but he was devastated, and it took him several weeks to get his bearings again, and then he swore he would get a wife before he'd get another dog, which he did. And he married Joanne in 1990, after which I said, well, now you can get another dog. But Joanne was a cat person, and so my father, by default, became a cat person, and of course, the feline version of Skip was Spit. So he wrote, my dog Skip, and then he wrote my cat Spit McGee.
In these various letters to you, once you had grown up and become a photographer, he was very proud of what you had done. He took great pride, and he expressed it in those letters. He also encouraged you to write as well as to take pictures, and some of that is reflected in this book that we're talking about today, because you've got quite a bit of text that you wrote to go with the photograph. So, that's bound to have, warmed your relationship up, for him to take such pride and interest. He was making recommendations and
And at this point, I want to talk about how much influence Curtis had on the early versions of this project, because I transcribed these letters several years after my father died, and I did a little prototype that included pictures and letters, and I sent a copy to Curtis. And I recently found the letter that he wrote me in response, and many of the suggestions he made ended up being incorporated into the project. But the one that stands out the most, he wanted to see more of me. He wanted to know more about me. And he said, do you have any letters that you wrote to him? And there were a few, but I didn't have copies of them. And I think then in a subsequent conversation, we started talking about self-portraits. And I said, well, I've got a lot of self-portraits, because, as a photographer, taking self-portraits is kind of like a rite of passage. If you're in a college photography class, one of the assignments inevitably is going to be take a self-portrait. So I started going through all my old negatives, and I found just lots and lots of self-portraits. So, Curtis said, I want to know what the young man he was writing to looked like. So, that alone I need to thank Curtis for. And there was a line in the letter, I can't remember exactly what it was from 2005, where you said this could end up being a labor of love. You said, I don't know how much energy you have to pursue this, but this could end up being a labor of love, and it has indeed ended up being a labor of love. And my attitudes and my perspective has changed over the course of the 15 or so years that I've worked on this.
After Willie moved back home, it was almost like he had written north toward home, and a great relief to get out of Mississippi. And here he is coming back 20 odd years later, and it's almost a reverse liberation, it seemed to me, and he moved to Oxford, and as you say, he joined the faculty here, became very much a fixture in the Oxford community, and it seems in many ways that began, you know, a very nice period in his life for all the other problems we talked about. He was happy here.
He loved being back in Mississippi. You know, he just, you know, enough had changed for him to be comfortable being back, and he just delighted in being back and the rituals that still, that he was able to observe. But at the same time, you know, being able to focus on a subject like Marcus Dupree and the implications that that had with Marcus coming from Philadelphia. And, you know, he still had that critical eye in terms of being able to see the shortcomings that still needed to be fixed.
Both you and your dad knocked around quite a bit in your lives, and I think David is the only bona fide deadhead I've ever known. That he actually, you know, the deadheads
I've got my dancing very soft side.
you know, they were kind of, you know, hippies, if you will, people who loved the music of Grateful Dead, and traveled all over the country listening to David and Susanna too.
Now Curtis had confessed to me once many years ago that he saw the Grateful Dead in Philadelphia on March the 24th, 1973. And I can't remember whether I gave you a tape.
I have it, and I showed it to someone just
They
there.
actually, the band put out an official release of that whole show. So, and he confessed to other things that I will not embarrass him about what he did that night at that show.
Yeah, we're talking about you and Willie.
Well, no, actually, my father looked at me being a deadhead somewhat whimsically, and he sort of accepted. I don't think he quite understood it. I'm not sure I quite understand it, but he was very amused by the whole idea of traveling around listening to music.
Yeah, it didn't strike me he was critical at all of saying, shape up, you know, do something with your life other than following this jam band around. But at the same time, Willie, you know, had his own unorthodox lifestyle. Kind of here, kind of revolved around the faculty row house in Tahoka
And the Holiday Inn Bar.
and the Holiday Inn Bar, yeah. And anyway, you know, both of your lives, I think, were stabilized by the introduction of women. That you met Susanna Dietschel, a young German scholar at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture here at Ole Miss, and you all have been together
35 years.
that long. You have to hard to believe. David, well, just a side note, David, because it was 6 hours later in England, but for all practical purposes, he was born right about the time Billy Cannon was returning that goddamn punt on Halloween night of 1989 that cost us the national championship. And Willie always talked about that he was not only concerned about this child who was about to be born, but he was trying to find out how was the game going on over in the state.
A number of years ago, I was working on another documentary on the 50th anniversary of the Meredith crisis, and I was interviewing Robert Kayat, who of course was playing on that team, and we were, you know, having a very serious discussion. And I said, "Okay, Chancellor, we're gonna segue into something else." I said, "I was born on November 1st, 1959. What were you doing 12 hours before?" And he scratched his head. He said, "Well, we were losing a football game. So all I have to do is say that in Mississippi or Louisiana, and people will know exactly what I'm talking about." And, you know, ironically, the coach of LSU was Paul Dietzel, no relationship to Susanna. But I never heard, in spite of the tremendous rivalry between Ole Miss and LSU, I never heard anyone say a bad word about Coach Dietzel. And years ago, I was in Miami, in Oxford, Ohio, covering the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama had come to Miami University, and I was photographing him, and they had the press set up in a field house overlooking the football stadium, and I looked out, and there was, in the south end zone, there was a Redbird Hall of Fame, and they had these tremendous flags dedicated to the people from Miami University who had, you know, made great contributions to the football team, and there on one of the flags it said Dietzel, and I said, got to be the same one, and sure enough, he had gone from Miami, I think, to somewhere else, and then come to LSU.
Yeah, I think he was in Army at one point, before he went to LSU.
But on my 27th birthday, Ole Miss played LSU in Tiger Stadium, and that was the famous missed field goal when Ole Miss won 21-19, and we were there, and it was a grand celebration, and we actually went back to the cabin in the Cone to celebrate, and the late great Professor David Sansing was with us, and at about 4 in the morning, he got up to drive back to Natchez to see his granddaughter, who now teaches school in New Orleans. And my father was watching. We had Vern had taped the game, and it was in the fourth quarter. And David said, "Willie, who's winning?" And he said, "I don't know. It's not over yet."
Anyway, you get united with Susanna, and a few years later, another product of that era at Ole Miss, Ole Miss girl who was there when I was there, Joanne Pritchard, was Willie's editor at University Press in Mississippi, and one thing led to another, and they were married in 1990, and as David says in the book, she saved his life, and certainly, you know, he enjoyed another 10 years of his life. So it just struck me that both of you all were very lucky in your choice of mates.
And Joanne and I, you know, continue to be the protector of the legacy, and you know, take it very seriously. And in these sort of very questionable, dark times, you know, I think my father's work is even more important, and understanding why it's important, and that reading North Toward Home and Yazoo, Integration in a Deep Southern Town, and according to Marcus Dupree, if you read it, it will make you uncomfortable, because he deals with a lot of issues, and you know, there's this movement now to not make, especially in schools, that we don't want our students to be uncomfortable in what they're reading. And so I suggested, when we dedicated the literary trail marker to my father in Yazoo City a few weeks ago, that, you know, should we ban North Toward Home?
Yeah.
So, words of caution.
Yeah. Do you think Willie would like this book?
Everybody, all of his old friends who have read it have told me that they think that he would be very proud of me. I would hope that he would like it. I would hope that it's honest, but it's loving. It's not judgmental. There are certainly pictures that I took that are much meaner than ones that are included. There are ones that are very mean that I did not include because I didn't want to be mean. It's honest, it's loving, and you know, I just want to say a word about Kaylee Jones. I think she wrote a beautiful, beautiful foreword, and I told her when I tracked her down that she was the only one who could do it because she knew all the characters, and I was responding to. She wrote a book called Lies My Mother Never Told Me, about the deterioration of her relationship with her mother after her father died, And it really blew me away because I knew all of the characters. I knew her father, I knew her mother, I knew the cousins, I knew the satellite friends she mentioned. And I had this epiphany, and I tracked her down. I hadn't talked to her in 20 years. And I said, Kaylee, you have to do this because you're the only one who can do it. And she went off and she wrote something exactly what I was hoping for, something kind and loving and honest.
David, I think it's a very lovely and honest book. Thank you for it.
Any questions? Or any answers?
Yeah, you mentioned Kaylee.
What?
You mentioned Kaylee Jones, and she's the perfect person for this. You know, Willie took us up to Gloria Jones's Memorial Day bash at Chateau's Bud, and I got to know some of the people who were there with George Plimpton and William Styron and John Knowles. And the first thing I noticed was this intellectual energy. It was a different plane. It was like social animals on steroids. And the two of you grew up there, and my impression is that you weren't intimidated by that because it was your milieu. You were used to it. You took it for granted, but you came out of that very strong. Both of you did, and you can see that in her introduction and in your book. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things I said to you was, I knew Willie would love this book. He would love the courage in it and the truth in it.
And of course, Kaylee quit drinking too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she quit drinking, I think it was after I was. I mean, she and I are roughly the same age, and we were very close in high school because I would come out and visit when my father was living there, and of course, her father was my father's best friend. So our lives were very intertwined, and we graduated the same year, and then, you know, she went one way and I went the other, and it wasn't that we made a conscious decision we weren't going to be friends anymore. Our lives just took different trajectories, and we didn't really see each other much. But that's been one of the real joys of this project, is being sort of reunited with her, and we're hoping to do some events on the East Coast in the fall, which would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, salute to you, kudos to you. Thank you.
Curtis, I don't want to encroach on the south side time, so